Good morning or afternoon to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar this morning. Today we are going to be talking about the science and technology of landfill litter control. My name is Sarah Bolton, and I'm the new Business Development Manager here at Blue Ridge Services, and I will also be the webinar moderator for today. You can reach me at Sarah, S-A-R-A-H, at blueridgeservices.com. You can also send me a chat in your chat box, and we'll go over where that is in just a moment during the webinar if you have any questions or need help getting logged in. Before we get started, I just want to cover a couple of housekeeping and technical items. So everyone should be logged in to GoToWebinar and see their GoToWebinar control panel. If you don't see this full control panel as it appears here, you can just click the orange arrow at the top or at the top of the little sidebar and it should expand out. So you've either joined the audio using your computer speakers or you've called in through your phone. So just make sure that whichever option you're using, you've then chosen that option on your control panel. So you can send questions at any point during the webinar today. We will take time at the end of the presentation to go over any questions and comments that come in. But if you think of something while we're going through the webinar, feel free to send it over. I'll keep track of it and then pass those on to our presenters at the end. We will be sending out a full recording of today's webinar after today, and as well as any handouts or additional materials that we discussed during the presentation. So if you want to watch this again or share it with a colleague, you will have the option to do that. This is for anybody who might be having audio issues. From what I can see, everybody's looking good, but you can always send me a chat in that chat box and I can help you out if you're having any trouble. If you see a timer in the middle of your screen, you can just click and drag it out of the way. Sometimes it pops up, sometimes it doesn't, but just in case, that's how you would move it out of your way. And we would love to have you all join us for one of our upcoming webinars. We're going to be covering, we have 3 webinars coming up. We have 2 on MRFs, Materials Recovery Facilities. So we're going to be talking about contamination on September 10th. And then on September 24th, we're going to be talking about MRF operations. Are you focused on the right things? We're going to be talking a lot about process improvement and, you know, what you're diverting, should you be diverting it, some really good content in that webinar. So make sure you check those out. I will send out the registration links for all of these when I send out the recording. And then for those of us who are in California, you're probably very familiar with the new legislation, SB 1383. So we're going to be talking about that and looking at these new changes to the industry through the lens of process improvement and how you can use process improvement to really help get on the right page from the very beginning with this new organics processing mandate. So that's going to be August 27th at 10 a.m. Pacific time. And again, I will send out the registration link for that as well. All right, so excuse me, I'm going to pass things over to our first presenter today. Jason, are you on?
I'm on.
All right, sound good. And you should have the screen. And I see your screen, so you're
Alrighty.
good to go.
Thank you, Sarah. So good morning, everyone. Possibly afternoon, as Sarah mentioned for some of you. Looks like we have a good crowd today. We appreciate you taking the time to attend this webinar. As Sarah mentioned, we're going to be discussing the science and technology of landfill litter control. A quick bio about myself. My name is Jason Todaro. I'm a solid waste operations consultant with Blue Ridge Services. I have approximately 25 years of varied experience in the heavy construction, utility, and solid waste industries. Prior to becoming a consultant, I've worked as a laborer, I've worked as a truck driver, heavy equipment operator, grade checker, foreman, and operations superintendent. As a consultant, I've been involved with solid waste projects across the United States. I frequently work in Canada. I've done some work in Australia, and probably the farthest that I've traveled is I've done some work at a landfill in Papua New Guinea, which was an interesting experience. Many of these projects were focused on operational and safety improvement, and often I I used classroom and hands-on field training as a tool. I can be reached at Jason, Jason, at blueridgeservices.com. So feel free to reach out to me after the webinar if you have any additional questions or want to chat about anything. So today we're going to be talking about landfill litter, and this slide kind of highlights the evolution of landfill litter. You know, I think we can all agree on these statements that landfills process garbage, you know, waste or refuse or other commonly used terms. When not controlled and wind is presented, this garbage can migrate throughout the site and beyond, which leads to litter issues. I think we can all agree wind-driven litter is a challenging and universal issue for all types and configurations of landfills. Litter is generated at landfills in other ways, such as, you know, uncovered loads and maybe other processing areas at the site. But today we're really going to focus on the topic of controlling wind-driven litter. So that leads us to our first poll question. How windy is your landfill? So we have five options here. We can you can pick extremely windy, somewhat windy, average, not very windy, calm as a day in the park.
All right. Thanks, Jason. So I already see lots of you jumping in on this. Just to let you know, it's completely anonymous, so nobody sees your answer. It'll just give us some percentages based on the group today. It's always kind of interesting to see who's on today and how they fall on these questions. So we'll have 4 of these questions today, and you don't have to participate, but it is kind of interesting. Also, for anybody who joined late, welcome, and you will be getting a full recording of the webinar today. So if you missed the first couple minutes, don't worry, you will get that full recording. You can catch up or you can share it with a colleague. All right, I'm going to give just a few more seconds if anybody else wants to jump in on this poll question. All right, looks like we're slowing down, so I'm going to go ahead and share those. So what we have today, 16% said that their landfill is extremely windy, 58% said somewhat windy, and 26% said average.
All right, thank you, Sarah. So I think by those poll responses, we can all see that, you know, all landfills have some degree of wind. 16% being extremely windy, that's an interesting number. And the majority, 60%, said somewhat windy. I think it's fair to say that, you know, all landfills have some degree of wind, and I think I think the reason for that is that we're all challenged with dealing with landfill litter, and I think that dealing with that landfill litter really makes us notice the wind more. So getting back to wind, you know, it's really important to understand wind speed, direction, and seasonality. And one of the ways to utilize that wind data is to use real-time or rely on real-time weather data. And, you know, another form of that would be just observing the weather. Some of the things that go with the real-time weather data, you know, it's the most common approach. It's the, you know, the photos we have here. It's the windsock on the landfill litter screen. When that windsock is full and it's you know, carrying litter, we can obviously all observe that it's pretty windy. Another approach would be a handheld wind speed indicator that, you know, you can put up in the air and see actually how windy it is. Using real-time weather data, it's an important tool, obviously, but it's really, if it's the only tool that's being used as far as wind data or weather data, it's more of a reactive than proactive approach, because by that time the wind's blowing and you might have to move fences or reposition fences. So it's an important tool, but it should be considered one of the tools in the tool bag. In some cases, it might not be safe or efficient to operate in high wind conditions. Some sites utilize thresholds. You know, general ranges are in the 30 to 45 mile per hour range that determine if the wind is so severe that they might even close the site. So these real-time weather data or observations are important in determining if you've exceeded your on-site wind thresholds. And obviously, you know, the real-time weather is that direct form of weather that's creating and generating wind-driven litter. Another important weather tool is forecasted weather data. Obviously, an on-site weather station is best. There's a good picture here that this is at a landfill in California, that their on-site weather station was at the highest point of the landfill. It was mobile, and this reported to their database, and they could even access it from their cell phones. So they could not only get the real-time data, which we discussed, but they could also get the forecasted data from their on-site weather station. And that's really the perfect situation to have on-site forecasted and real-time weather data. If you don't have an on-site weather station to do forecasting, nearby airports, often schools or university, public facilities, and then you can also rely on the news and then online sources. By understanding the forecasted weather, it allows you to prepare in advance for potential wind events. Rather than just waiting for that real-time weather, you can actually predict in advance. This advance warning allows you to move or possibly reposition litter fences as needed. Understanding the forecasted weather could allow you to maybe make a call for additional labor if you're anticipating a large wind event. It can also allow you to notify your customers and haulers that the site might be shutting down due to high winds. Another form of weather data that's really important and probably underutilized is utilizing historic weather data. I have a quote here: "I have seen the future and it's very much like the present, only longer." So having long-time historic weather data for your landfill is a really important tool. Reviewing wind data is an excellent way to identify historic trends such as seasonality, wind speed, and direction. This historic weather data is typically represented as a windrows diagram, which is pictured on the screen. And this diagram is a way of illustrating historic speed, direction for a specific time frame. So if we look at this specific windrows, it's showing that over this time frame, whatever that time frame may be, it could be a month, it could be a year, it could be 10 years of data. It's showing at this weather station that predominantly the wind blows out of the northwest or from the northwest. So this is a really good way as far as positioning fences or kind of anticipating more of the seasonal wind trends, what the weather might do at your site based on historic weather data. Data from on-site weather station is best. If you can generate a windrows for your site using an on-site weather station, that's really the most accurate form. But kind of like we talked about before, if you can jump online, you can find a windrows typically for an airport that's in the vicinity, a school, public facility, and then there's online sources as well. This is a really good tool to review prior to establishing fill areas. Where are you going to fill next? Where are you going to fill in the spring? Where are you going to fill in the winter? Reviewing this weather data is a really good way to determine that you might want to not be on an outside slope next to the property boundary during the seasonal high winds. You might go to a sheltered fill area, which Troy is going to talk about some. So this is a really good tool that I often see in my travels. It's underutilized. So we've established that landfills have garbage and they have wind. Why is that important? What's the importance of controlling landfill litter? There's many topics and many factors to discuss here. Obviously the big one is regulatory compliance. That's something that's important. You can get violations, you can get areas of concern. Obviously neighbor relations, adjacent property owners, they don't want litter blowing onto their property, whether it be a farm field or their residence or whatever it may be. There's plenty of landfill opponents out there that don't like having a landfill in their backyard, and when litter is leaving the site or the site looks unkept, that could be a negative observation. Customer perception, when customers are on site using the facility, if the landfill is saturated with litter and there's litter spread all over the place, that's not a good thing. And then the other thing is allowing litter to spread throughout the site. It's very costly to clean up. There's a lot of labor requirement to clean that up. So those are kind of some of the main, not the only, but the main factors in why we want to keep landfill litter under control. So defensive versus offensive strategies. In our travels, performing operations assessments and on-site training, we get to see all different types of landfills of varying size and configurations and different parts of the country and different countries, as I mentioned. But typical elements that we see and observe that we kind of characterize as a defensive or reactive strategy to controlling litter. These defensive strategies, they tend to rely solely on real-time weather data or observation. It's kind of the, hey, it's windy, we should probably move some litter fences or get prepared for this. There's minimal use of forecasted or historic weather data. We often find that there's minimal internal fencing, which we categorize as portable or temporary fencing, and we'll get into more detail about that in a minute. And often these internal fences aren't close enough to the point of generation where the landfill litter comes from, and that's the active tipping face or the tipping floor area. We often see the use of large, very expensive, kind of what's in the picture here, permanent fencing. This fencing is often at the site perimeter or the property boundary. And one of the things that comes with those large fences, especially the one pictured, is when that fence gets plugged with litter, it's very difficult to remove litter in the higher elevations of those fences, and it can be very cumbersome and challenging from a labor standpoint. We often find with defensive strategies that there's minimal effort when the wind is being or the litter is being generated, and it's blowing and migrating throughout the site, and that these sites tend to wait for a complaint by a customer or someone from off-site, or in many cases a regulator gets involved and says, hey, you have a litter issue that you need to deal with. So those are kind of some of the common things we see with this kind of wait and see reactive defensive approach. On the flip side, we have the offensive strategy, and these are the things that we're going to really focus on and talk about today. Typical elements of an offensive or proactive strategy to controlling litter are as follows. These offensive strategies typically rely heavily on forecasted and historic weather data. They do use real-time weather data as a tool to make adjustments. These offensive strategies effectively use portable and temporary fencing near the points of generation, the tipping areas at the landfill. And these sites tend to view the permanent fencing, which is often, the perimeter security fencing at this point, not necessarily that large, expansive permanent fence we showed earlier, but these sites that are taking this offensive approach, they view the permanent fencing as a final containment layer and not necessarily the primary containment layer. These sites have staffing that's available to promptly remove litter from portable and temporary fencing, which minimizes the migration of the litter throughout the site. And these sites also remove litter proactively. They don't wait for a complaint or regulatory involvement. So that leads us to our next poll question number 2. With these kind of strategies in mind, which litter control strategy best represents your efforts at your landfill? The options we have are a defensive approach, which we mentioned, an offensive approach, and possibly a hybrid, a little bit of both. And then, the last option is maybe you don't have a strategy. So we'd like to see what you have to say here.
All right, great. Thanks, Jason. So I see you guys getting some answers logged on this poll question. If anybody joined us a little bit late, no worries, welcome. We will be sending out a full recording of the webinar today, so if you missed any part of it, you will get the chance to go back and rewatch it. You can also send it to a colleague to share. So just to remind everybody, you can start sending in any questions or comments you have. You have a questions tab on your control panel, and we will take some time at the end of the presentation to answer any questions that come in. So if you think of something and you don't want to forget, you can just go ahead and send it over through that questions tab, and I will keep track of those, and I will make sure that our presenters get them. So I still see some answers coming in. I'm going to wait just a few more seconds so that you guys can have a chance to get an answer logged in. And just to remind everybody, these are totally anonymous, so nobody will actually see your answer, but it is really interesting just to see where the group is at today. All right, so I am going to wait about 5 more seconds just in case somebody's thinking on this and you need just a little bit more time. All right, looks like everybody's jumped on, so I'm going to close and share those results. So today we have 15% are using a defensive strategy, 30 are using an offensive strategy, 45% do a little bit of both of those, and 10% don't really have a litter strategy today.
All right, thank you, Sarah. Yeah, those are really interesting results. The 45% hybrid, a little of both. I anticipated seeing that. We clearly had the 15% defensive, and then the 30% offensive. That's really good to see. And then the sites with the 10%. Hopefully, you can take away something from this webinar, and utilize some of these things to help develop your strategy. So thank you, Sarah. So what is the most effective strategy? Is it offensive? Is it defensive? Is it a hybrid? The ultimate answer is, it's what works for your site. There's so many factors that go into this. It's what works at your site. And then, through trial and error, sometimes you learn things that don't work at your site. We have found in our travels that with proper implementation, an offensive litter fencing strategy can be very effective. It provides redundancy and flexibility for the landfill operator. We view this as a complete system that utilizes several layers of litter fencing rather than just relying on that large perimeter permanent fence. We like to see almost a layered approach that relies very heavily on portable litter fencing, which we'll talk about. And then as a secondary measure, the use of temporary litter fencing. And then as a last and final layer, permanent litter fencing. So we're going to jump into those and discuss those in more detail. So portable litter fencing. In our view, portable litter fencing is most effective when used to control litter at the points of generation. In landfill cases, it's usually the tipping area. That's where the majority of the litter is originating from. These portable litter fences, similar to the ones that are pictured, and there's lots of makes and manufacturers out there. They can be built locally, which we've often seen. They can be ordered from a fencing manufacturer. Typically, we like to see these portable fences in height ranges from 12 to 15 feet, approximately 20 foot wide. These fences must be durable. They must be easy to regularly move with heavy equipment. When they're deployed and they're utilized, they should be deployed at the highest adjacent elevation. We want to minimize the ability for this windblown litter to blow from the tipping area and over the top of the fence. So if depending on your sequencing or where your waste cell is, if you have the ability to put that fence up higher on a waste mass or a soil berm, we like to see that. And Troy's going to talk about that in a little bit more detail. These fences must be deployed as close to the tipping area without limiting vehicle equipment traffic. Often we see these fences being used, but they're really, really far from the active tipping floor or active waste cell. And our goal is to get these as tight and as close to the active tipping area where the litter is generated from. But the caveat to that is we don't want to impede vehicle or customer traffic. We don't want to create a safety issue by doing that. So there's a balance there. The individual fencing sections should be tightly arranged, limiting openings which can allow a litter to escape. Often we see really nice fences that have 2-foot gaps in between the individual sections, and that's a problem. When the fence starts loading up with litter, it almost creates a vacuum and will pull that litter off the fence and out in the opening. But if we're going to deploy these types of fences, we want them very tightly configured, and we want to minimize any openings and gaps. It's important that fences should be regularly maintained to repair any damaged or missing screen material, and often bent frames as well. We'll see with these types of fences, when the frames get bent, it prevents them from being arranged in a manner that the fences can touch each other and minimize those openings. So if the frame's bent, it's difficult to do that. Often we see sites that have damaged screens that are being utilized. We like to see those pulled out of service and have a maintenance or a repair plan in place to repair those and get them back into service. There's options to overlap this type of fencing, as you can see in the picture. That way we have continuous litter control and containment, but we can still allow customer vehicles to enter and exit the tipping area. And this picture represents that pretty well. One of the downfalls of these types of fences, especially the large ones, in some cases, when these fences become saturated or really plugged up with litter, in really high winds, they can blow over and create a safety issue and, you know, potentially hurt somebody or a piece of equipment. So as these fences are utilized and they're effective, there needs to be some mechanism in place to remove the litter that's building up in them. So that kind of covers the basics of portable litter fencing. We're going to get into temporary litter fencing. And these terms are just terms that we use that kind of represent what we're talking about in the types of fences. We've used different terms and you may use different terms. We're trying to really have some really basics here. Temporary litter fencing is most effective when used as a secondary litter control measure beyond the point of generation, which is the tipping floor, and the portable litter fencing zone, which we just talked about. So this is the next layer kind of in this system. Typically, these types of fences are constructed using metal T-posts at 6 to 10 foot spacing intervals. And they use welded woven wire fencing that's about 4 to 6 foot high, kind of what's pictured here. We've seen other things. We've seen the orange construction fencing be used. There's lots of different types of fences or materials that can be used for this type of fence. This type of fencing should be temporarily erected to surround, maybe 1 to 3 months of landfill airspace. And that airspace should coincide with the landfill's fill progression planning. Additional layers of temporary fencing can be used for known problem areas. Often there's topographic challenges where you can't place one of the large portable fences on. So this type of fence is good to use there. The type of fencing should be salvaged when moved and reused. So this fence, it's intended, you set it up for a period of time. When your fill progression moves, you take the fence with you, you reuse it. So from a cost standpoint, it's a pretty low cost fence when you consider how many times and how many years in best case scenarios it could be used. Horizontal and vertical litter traps can be integrated in the top and the end of the fence runs, which prevents litter from blowing off the fence. So once this fence, the face of this fence captures the litter, if at the end of the run, if you put a litter trap, just basically a 90-degree, 6 to 8 foot run, you can keep that litter if the wind changes directions from blowing off the fence and then becoming litter. The lower picture here shows more of a horizontal litter trap, which is basically the same thing, but it protrudes off the top of the fence and it keeps that litter from blowing off the top of the fence. And then our last kind of litter fence category here is permanent litter fencing. Permanent perimeter security fencing can also be used to capture any residual litter that has migrated beyond the primary layers, which is the portable and temporary fences that we just discussed. Typically, these types of fences are constructed out of chain link material and run from about 6 to 8 foot in height. Very, very similar to what we have pictured here in the top image. Single cantilevered brackets can be installed outward for security reasons, for site security reasons. But they also do make double cantilevered brackets, what I have pictured there, that can face inward and outward, so they can, from the outward cantilever can serve the security purpose, and the inward is kind of just an extra measure to keep that litter from blowing up the face of the fence and over the top. Permanent perimeter security fencing should be considered as a component of a litter control system. Sometimes we see it being relied on as really the only litter fencing that's being used on site, and we like to use that as a final layer, not the primary layer. Accumulated litter should be promptly cleaned up before it's allowed to blow off site. Typically these perimeter fences, they're on the property boundary. So if the litter is on the inside of the fence, it's not going to take much to get that litter off site, which is obviously a regulatory concern. So we like to clean up this litter that's made it this far as promptly as we can. So that leads us to our third poll question. Of these types that we're discussing, which type of litter fencing do you rely on the most? The first option is portable litter fencing. The second is temporary litter fencing. The third is permanent litter fencing. And then 4 would be a combination of of all the above. And then the other option would be other, we don't use litter fencing.
Okay, great. I already see lots of answers coming in. You guys are kind of pros at this by now. So I will give a little bit more time to let everybody get an answer logged in. And just to remind everybody, make sure you get your questions in so we can get to those at the end of the presentation. I'm going to give just a little bit more time as some more answers come in, just in case you guys need a little bit more time to think about this. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close this poll out and share the results. So today we have 16% are using some sort of portable litter fencing, 11% are using temporary litter fencing. We don't have anybody using permanent, and then 58% are using some sort of combination of the above 3, and then 16% either they're using something different or they don't use litter fencing at all.
All right, thank you, Sarah. Yeah, those are interesting responses. The 58% a combination, that really defines that kind of layered approach in some way, shape, or form. I like to see the 16% portable litter fencing. I think that's, when used properly, that's a really effective tool. The temporary litter fencing, can be effective. The biggest challenge there is the limited height. And then the 16% other, we don't use litter fencing. Some of those might be consultants possibly, or people that, aren't directly involved with daily landfill operations, but all very, very interesting findings. The fact that 0% are relying solely on the permanent litter fencing, that's good to see, because that's something that we definitely typically recommend otherwise. So thanks for those poll responses. So with all those litter fences, when considering the wind direction, considering the effectiveness of these fences, and often we see that fence maintenance and litter removal, this is kind of the way you finalize this whole system. Often these things are overlooked. To perform as intended, all types of litter fencing must be regularly maintained. They get damaged when they're moved. Sometimes they blow over in high winds and get dented or damaged. The screening material, depending on what it's made of, can tear and have openings. But these are all maintenance concerns that we recommend having systems in place to identify the damage, pull them out of service, get them repaired, and get them quickly back into service. A really useful, quick tip with that is number your litter fencing sections if they're the portable type like this. Just a big decal or a painted number. That way you can call, a landfill operator and say, hey, pull fence number 3 and 17 out of service. They've got damage. Let's get them out of there. Let's get them fixed and repaired and get them back into service. So effective litter fencing will capture litter. This litter must be regularly collected and disposed of. We typically see sites that are, they're doing many things right. They've got their fences up, they're deployed correctly, but they fall short when it's time to actually clean up or remove the litter. And that's something that obviously, if you're going to all that expense and effort, to kind of close the loop, we want to collect and remove that litter from the fencing before it's allowed to spread throughout the site. You can use manual labor. There's a picture of a vacuum system here towed by a 1-ton pickup. That's very effective. It makes short work of it. That's a good tool. Another thing is define who will be tasked with cleaning up litter. Is it site staff? Is it contract labor? Is it another arrangement? Is it a work release or a county jail program? We've seen all configurations of that, but ask yourself, if the wind blew tomorrow and we had a large litter event, who's going to clean it up? Have a plan in advance. Don't just pile up litter, contain it in trash cans. When you're sending somebody out to clean up the litter, we often see that people will kind of rake it up into a pile, and then it's really not ever collected. And then the wind kicks up again and it blows and migrates throughout the site. So contain it in trash cans, garbage bags, vacuums, etc. So these are all kinds of ways to really close the loop and really ensure that your litter control system does what it's intended to do. So that concludes my discussion on these kind of basic litter control and containment strategies. As Sarah mentioned, at the end of the webinar, I'll be available to answer any questions. Feel free to email me if you have any questions beyond the webinar. Right now, I'm going to do a handoff to Troy Keckley, who's going to discuss some more advanced tactics that he's been working on.
Thanks, Jason, and welcome everybody. Hopefully you've been enjoying this and it's been informative for you. For those of you who haven't heard me present before, just a brief background. I have 25 years experience in the solid waste mining and civil engineering industry. I've worked with Blue Ridge Services off and on since 1993, and I'm responsible for all the landfill airspace management plans for the company. I am based out of Bozeman, Montana, so I'm one of the outliers of the company, which is good for me, and it's a great opportunity to share information with everybody through these webinars. So. A lot of civil design background and Superfund remediation, mass grading projects, and that's really where I'm going to kind of touch on today is how we can use kind of a long-term strategy and some technology to start tackling the problem with litter in a little more aggressive manner. So this will be our final poll question. So just a real quick one. Does your long and short-term site sequencing take into account the prevailing winds? So that's a yes or no or not sure.
All right, thanks, Troy. So this is our last poll question for today. So if you haven't participated yet and you really just have a burning desire to participate in a poll question, this is your last chance. Just to remind everybody, as Troy kind of takes us toward the home stretch today, if you have any questions, make sure you get those in the questions box on your control panel. And I still see a few answers coming in, so we'll wait just a few more seconds to wrap this one up before Troy keeps moving forward. And like Troy and Jason and I all said, you can always reach out to us after the webinar today if you have questions or would like more information about anything that we're talking about. All right, so last about 5 seconds if you want to jump in on this poll, go for it before I close it out. All right, so I'm going to share those results, and we have 38% say yes, 24 say no, and 38 say they are not sure.
Okay, so and that's kind of what I was expecting. In some sites they're really on it, particularly with the short-term planning, and they're knowing how they're doing their lifts and trying to optimize how they're protecting their working face with the topography. And others, they haven't taken that into account, and the others, well, maybe you're not sure. And this is hopefully what this webinar is going to do is get everyone thinking and start thinking of a strategic way of how do we work our site from beginning to end that takes advantage and works with the wind instead of fighting it. And that's the problem is oftentimes we're trying to fight the wind, and we really can't. It's the wind is always going to be there. We really have no control over it other than what we can place upstream and downstream of our active areas. What's interesting is there's a lot of industries that take great measures to reduce wind velocities around their working areas. This includes mining industries and agricultural communities and stuff that the whole goal is not to catch things on the downstream side, but to reduce the velocities on the upstream side, so that wind-blown particulates is not a factor. And so that's what we're going to kind of touch on today in thinking a bigger strategy of how we deal with this. So in doing this, because we are talking a strategy, it's about placement. If you've ever played chess or checkers for that matter, it's all about setting your pieces in the right place at the right time to get that win. And so for litter control, just like Jason's talked about, we have a lot of pieces in play, and we talked about the fences, the portables and the temporaries and the permanents, but we also have where our active face is, and we touched on that in terms of the seasonal location for it. But as we're going to show a little bit, the importance of how we're placing our berms that we maybe strategically locate that contains our daily and intermediate cover soils, and then also our long-term sequencing that create a topography as we fill the site, how that can impact our site in terms of the wind velocities. So our goal here is, again, not to stop the wind, but we just want to move it. We want to relocate it, and if we can't relocate it, we want to at least slow it down in the areas that we're working. And so if any of you have ridden in the back of an open bed pickup truck, if you're sitting on the sides, you're getting a lot of wind, a lot of kick up, but if your back is against the cab of the truck, it's actually pretty quiet there. It's a dead air zone. And so what we're trying to do is by using fencing and berms and topography, we're going to try to create what's called a ski jump effect on that laminar wind flow, so that it goes up and over our working areas. And this is very common in the areas of North America, well, the world for the matter, where drifting snow is a factor, or we need to protect livestock or prevent wind erosion for agricultural areas. And you've probably seen those lines of trees. They're called shelter belts. And the whole point of those trees is to create a porous, high obstruction. And what's key with that is that those porous obstructions, like vegetation or a fence in our arena, is that it creates vortices that forces that laminar wind flow up and over the area you're trying to protect. Okay. And so with doing that, both the height and the porosity matter. Okay. The height of the obstacle, fence or vegetation, has a dramatic impact on the reach of wind speed reduction. So, and there's a variety of formulas out there. There's been entire PhD theses done on this topic, and what we've seen is impacted areas of the area that of wind speed is reduced can be anywhere between 8 to 15 times the height of the fence, depending on the porosity and other factors. And the one common thing is that you don't use anything solid. Don't use a solid wall, because the area of protection is very short. And so I'm going to show an example of that. So this is a computational fluid dynamic model of just a standard chain link 9-gauge 2-inch opening fence, which is approximately an 85% porosity. Okay. And what you can see is the downwind impact on velocity is, so we obviously have a protected area, fairly protected, right near the fence, maybe out to about 50 feet. You can actually have a protection of maybe 70% reduction of felt wind. And then, 40%, we're getting a little beyond 50% or 60% reduction. But as the 50% reduction, now we're almost out to 100 feet, 40%, maybe 75, but a 30% reduction, we're out to about 200 feet potentially. Okay, and that's just a fence on the ground, nothing special done with it, but that's just to show the impact. Now, if we look at the wind velocity of a standard drift fence, which is about a 50% porosity, and those are just wood planks spaced. These are very common, used by highway departments and agricultural areas. Our 30% wind reduction reaches out over 300 feet. Okay, and so that's just to show the difference of the changes in porosity on the downwind impact of wind velocity. So the goal here is, again, just like that pickup truck with that laminar flow, is we want to create a deflection through the use of fencing and berms that will actually force the air up and over. So as you see this model start to run, you're going to start seeing that laminar flow start kicking up. And what's doing it is the vortices created by the perforations in the fencing. And that's where the porosity comes into play. By adding that fence to the top of a berm, we amplify that dramatically. And so that reach can go out. So we talked about that 8 to 15 times the height of the fence. Well, you start putting that on top of a berm, well, that reach goes out further and further. So keeping in with the whole strategy of battling litter, we want to set the board, but we got to start thinking in 3 dimensions. Okay, we want to look at, Jason talked about the downwind fences and everything. We're trying to catch that litter that is picked up from our working area and carried by the wind. But we want to start thinking about upwind as well. How can we place our fencing and berms upwind to create that laminar flow over the working areas? But we also want to look at how side fences can redirect it as well, because wind does change. Okay. And then also looking at how elevation can impact and benefit us or hinder us in some cases. And that's only you can only identify that through modeling and experimentation of your specific site. But by looking at all of those aspects, you can start figuring out, where do I need to set my pieces to have the most impact on the wind? So we had this picture up earlier, and it's a great example of just a well-run, well-placed litter fences at a site. And I like this one because it's a fully encompassed, it creates a capsule, so to speak, of containment. Now, what's interesting about it is most people will look at this and go, oh, it's great if the wind changes, it's going to catch it no matter where it goes. Well, it's deeper than that. And what we're going to do is we're going to show a model of both a plan view and cross section of how this fence layout impacts wind velocity. So as I start this model, you can start seeing that the interior of that fencing area, the velocity is actually about half of what it is on the exterior. Just by that surface flow is having to go around, it's slowed down, and in that interior area of that fencing is about 50% reduction in wind velocity. So that's one of the benefits. Now, whether or not the site knew that when they did it, it doesn't matter. That's what it was accomplishing. So now let's take a look at what this cross-sectional view, because remember I talked about that vertical aspect. And so just based on that photo, I created a cross-section view. This is, again, that left side fencing. This is what looks to be the working face. I kind of did an estimate of about a 2-to-1 slope. It looked like there was a raised berm area where an exterior access road. And so when I play that, this is what I'm talking about, creating that laminar flow. You're going to start seeing the overall airflow go up and over. And one of the key things is that downwind fence. For those of you who have newer pickups, or the next time you're out and about looking at a brand new pickup truck, take a look at the back of the tailgate. There's like a little ledge right on the top that now juts out the back. What that is the automotive industry has figured out that if we create a place for that laminar flow to land, it makes the vehicle more aerodynamic. Well, by placing a downwind fence, we're essentially doing that exact same thing. We're extending the reach of that laminar flow and thus creating a bigger protected area for a working face. So we got to use a long-term strategy for this. So everything I've just been shown is kind of that short-term, kind of that tactical approach for fighting litter. And we want to start thinking, okay, what is the strategic? What is the long-term strategy that we can use to fight it? Well, the only way we can do that is by how we fill our site and the topography that we create as we fill it to create a buffer. So this example is a site up in Canada. We have permission for them to use it. This is a project we've done for them. And they have a high wind issue. And it's been a real struggle for them. And so one of the things we're recommending is changing how they're doing their sequencing. Now, we're doing this keeping in mind all the surface water drainages and all of those criterias, but by changing how we're building and which direction we're building the site from in terms of the order, we start by building these lifts that are going to create a protected area. And so the wind is coming from the lower left, and you kind of see these benches that drop down. And the key is, if we just do that and we don't do any type of protection on that upper edge, our protected area really isn't that great. It's about a 20% reduction in velocities along that edge. But if I put a simple berm and a fence right where we're working, all of a sudden my protected area, I'm down almost a 70% reduction in velocities at that working face. And so as I move along that bench, as I'm filling, following the drainage out, I just keep moving that berm along as I'm using up that soil for my daily and intermediate cover. And that creates that protected zone as we fill. Okay, so that is taking into account that long-term strategy of how can we modify our site to take the most advantage of the topography to protect us from the wind, thus helping to mitigate the litter issue. So let's wrap this up. Winning the battle against litter takes a strategy of moving all the pieces to the right place at the right time. We've talked about the wind analysis and the weather forecasting and the portable and the temporary fences and all of those factors that come into play. And this really does require some operationally savvy planning, and it's got to be done with both a long and short-term perspective. So hopefully this presentation has been beneficial to everyone. If you have any questions, obviously feel free to shoot them to Sarah now, or you're welcome to contact us afterwards.
All right, thank you so much, Troy. So we do have a couple of questions. I think one might be something that we could follow up with. Somebody asked, can you share more pictures of the litter traps mentioned? So Jason, do we have some more pictures we could send out with the recording possibly?
Yeah, I have some. I can find those.
Okay, great. So we'll do that just so you guys can see some more examples of that. And then here's a question related to safety. How do you recommend working on or repairing portable litter fences in the 15 to 20 foot height range?
If I'm understanding the question or the kind of the concern, it's mainly due to the height. I think the safest way would be to lean them over rather than working on them as they're standing upright. Obviously, with maybe an excavator or a service vehicle with a crane to lower them down so they're more at ground level. I think that, if I'm understanding the question, that would be the safest way to deal with it.
Okay, great. So we'll wait just a few more seconds if anybody has any last minute questions, but you are welcome to reach out to us after the fact. And I think, one of the key things to keep in mind is that every facility is different. So we heard about a lot of different things, a lot of different types of technology and different litter fences. So, if you feel like you need some help sort of figuring that out for your site, definitely reach out to us, get in touch, because that's something that we do for a lot of landfills, and we can definitely help sort of find a tailor-made approach that will fit your specific needs. So Jason and Troy, do you guys have any final words before we sign off?
No, just thank you for joining us. We appreciate it.
All right. Well, thank you all so much, and look for that follow-up email, and feel free to reach out if you have any other questions. Have a great rest of your week.
Thank you.